Imagine just for a second, standing in a small traditional stone chapel in modern-day Wales.
Right, just a typical quiet countryside setting.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And you're listening to a congregation sing a hymn, right? And the language echoing off the walls is ancient Cymric, which is basically Welsh.
Yeah, a language that's been spoken there for thousands of years.
But now imagine taking the exact phonetic sounds of that hymn. I mean, the literal acoustic vibrations of those Welsh words, and applying them to the golden hieroglyphic bands wrapped around King Tutankhamun's inner coffin in Egypt.
Which sounds completely absurd at first.
Totally
Right.
absurd. But according to this staggering stack of sources we have in front of us today, if you do that, you don't get like magical incantations for the underworld. You actually get binding legal genealogical title deeds.
It's honestly a profound paradigm shift. I mean, we are looking at source materials today that completely invert the standard linear progression of history we've all been taught.
Right, because usually when we think about the story of human civilization, you open a textbook and it points to a very specific, undisputed cradle.
Yeah, it points to ancient Egypt, the Nile Valley, or Mesopotamia.
And the narrative just says, there it is. That's where it all started.
Exactly. The idea is that the East was advanced and the West was primitive. We really like an orderly progression of human development. It's a very comforting binary narrative.
It's incredibly clean. Like,
Yeah.
we're taught that the ancient Egyptians were building these staggering, astronomically aligned pyramids, while the people up in ancient Britain in Albion were basically just wandering around in animal skins.
Yeah, painting themselves blue with woad and just sort of waiting around for the Romans to finally show up and introduce the concept of a paved road.
Exactly. But the documents, the archaeological field data, and these new linguistic frameworks we are doing a deep dive on today present a completely different reality.
They really do. When you look at the physical artifacts dug out of the ground, and I mean looking at them not through the lens of Roman historical bias, but through strict forensic analysis, that neat little historical timeline just shatters.
Which brings us to our mission for you, the listener, today. We are analyzing a mountain of fascinating material. We've got revolutionary linguistic decoders, ancient pre-1700s maps, highly complex chronological grid systems.
And really deep-level archaeological data.
Yeah. And we are taking all of this to trace this epic trans-cataclysmic migration path that our sources call the sovereign circuit.
So, to set the stage for you, we're going to track a concept that fundamentally rewrites that textbook narrative. We are looking at a royal Cymric, which is to say, ancient British bloodline.
Okay, let's unpack this, because they didn't just passively receive civilization from the Mediterranean, right?
Not at all. According to these sources, this highly advanced sacerdotal elite actually migrated from Britain to Egypt, specifically to survive global cyclical cataclysms.
Wait, I have to stop you right there because I want to make sure I'm hearing this correctly. And I'm sure you listening right now are thinking the exact same thing. Are we seriously suggesting that ancient Britons traveled all the way to Egypt to use it as a giant geological panic room?
That is exactly what the sources argue. Yes.
Wow. Okay.
They used the arid, stable climate of the Nile Valley as a secure preservation vault. The whole goal was to record their knowledge, their legal deeds, and their advanced astronomy in materials that wouldn't degrade.
Right. Materials like stone of gold.
Exactly. And then, once the cataclysmic period passed, the descendants of that lineage returned to Britain to establish what we now know as the historical Arthurian dynasty.
It is a massive continent-spanning loop. I mean, it's a full circle. And to make any sense of these claims, this deep dive is going to rely on extracting two very distinct pillars of evidence from our sources, right?
Yes, our two main analytical focuses.
First, we have to look at the physical chain of custody. If this happened, they had to leave physical receipts, actual stones, earth mounds, and artifacts that prove this movement from Britain to Egypt and back.
And second, we have the linguistic key, because you have to ask, how do we actually read these records?
Right. The synthesis of those two things, the physical custody and the linguistic inheritance, is basically the only way to see the full picture. You really can't have one without the other.
No, you can't.
Okay, so conceptually, that is a wild ride. But before we can even begin to track a British elite migrating to Egypt, we really have to address the giant glaring elephant in the room.
Which is, why don't we know about this?
Exactly. If this actually happened, why isn't this in the history books? Why is this the first time I'm hearing about a transcontinental British Empire?
To understand that, we have to look at how the timeline itself was broken. The sources point heavily to the research of Alan Wilson and Burham Blackett.
Okay, who are they?
They are two alternative historical researchers who fundamentally changed the methodology of how we look at the past. And Wilson, crucially, didn't come from a dusty academic background of purely reading old texts.
What was his background?
He came from heavy industry. He was a master planner for massive shipbuilding projects.
Wait, like commercial shipyards. How on earth does that translate to ancient history?
Well, think about what a master planner in a shipyard has to do. They're managing millions of man-hours. They have to coordinate dozens of different specialized trades.
Right, it's incredibly complex.
Extremely. They have hundreds of thousands of individual pieces of metal, wiring, and machinery that all have to arrive at the exact right place in the exact right sequence at the exact right time, or the ship simply doesn't get built.
Okay, so it's intense, high-stakes logistics.
Exactly. And Wilson took those exact same industrial master planning techniques and applied them to the historical records of ancient Britain.
Okay, I see where this is going.
See, the standard academic view of early British history, the king lists, the genealogies, the battle records, was that it was mostly mythology because the dates contradicted each other constantly.
Right.
But Wilson and Blackett looked at this and said, this isn't a myth. This is just a logistical puzzle. It's basically a blown-apart haystack.
So they basically put British history into a massive forensic spreadsheet.
Yes. And when they did that, they found a very specific localized error that had warped absolutely everything. It's a 33-year misdating in the foundation of British history.
Walk me through the math on that. How does shifting a timeline by just 33 years magically solve the entire puzzle of ancient Britain?
Well, it all centers on a document called the Welsh Annals.
Okay.
The Annals are a chronological record, but they don't use the Gregorian calendar dates we use today. They simply count years sequentially, like year 1, year 2, year 3, recording what happened in each year.
But for modern historians to understand when year 1 actually was, they had to anchor it to a known historical event on the Roman calendar, right?
Precisely. You need a Rosetta Stone for the timeline itself. You need an anchor point.
Okay.
Now, in these annals, there is a mention of a letter sent by the Britons to a Roman general in Gaul asking for military help.
Okay.
Mainstream historians looked at this and decided, this letter must have gone to the famous Roman general named Aetius, spelled E-T-I-U-S, and we know Aetius was operating around the year 440 A.D.
So they pinned year 1 to 440 A.D. and just calculated everything forward and backward from there.
Right. But I'm guessing you can see the flaw coming.
I'm guessing Wilson and Blackett found a flaw in that anchor.
A massive one. First of all, the political context makes absolutely no sense. The sources note that the British at that time had just expelled the Romans and were furious with them.
Oh, so they wouldn't exactly be begging Aetius for help.
Exactly. But more importantly, if you look at the actual ancient manuscript of the Annals, it doesn't say Aetius. The scribes didn't write E-T-I-U-S.
What did they write?
The text clearly says Agitus, A-G-I-T-U-S. And in other corresponding manuscripts, it's written as Agnapius.
Wait, so mainstream history just assumed the ancient scribes misspelled the name of the guy they were writing to.
Yes. They forced the data to fit their assumption, but Wilson and Blackett pointed out that Agitus isn't a typo. It corresponds to a real, verifiable historical figure, Sergius Flavius Aegidius.
Okay, who was he?
He was the king of the Franks, ruling the 7 cities of France. But here's the kicker. He ruled around the year 474 A.D., not 440 A.D.
Oh, wow. So by anchoring year 1 to the wrong general, the mainstream historical timeline for ancient Britain was violently yanked out of place by about 33 or 34 years.
Exactly. And in a chronological spreadsheet, when you pull one structural thread out of alignment by 3 decades, the whole tapestry warps.
It's like someone accidentally changed the time zone on our historical clock by 33 years, and suddenly none of the trains, or in this case the kings and battles, are lining up at the station when they're supposed to.
That's a perfect analogy. Suddenly, kings are recorded as fighting battles 20 years after they supposedly died. Monasteries are granted to bishops who haven't even been born yet. Fathers are listed as younger than their sons.
Which is exactly why mainstream academics threw up their hands and said, this must just be a chaotic Dark Age mythology, because it looked like nonsense.
Yeah, it did. But when Wilson and Blackett corrected that single 33-year error using their master planning logistics, suddenly all the trains arrived at the station on time.
Wow.
The kings lived at the right times, the genealogies made biological sense, and crucially, the recorded battles perfectly aligned with independent physical data like the volcanic eruptions and comet strikes recorded in global tree ring data.
So a coherent, highly advanced British civilization suddenly emerged from the static just by fixing that one anchor point.
Exactly.
That is incredible. Just fixing a typo completely resurrects a lost civilization.
But I'm stuck on something you mentioned earlier.
What's that? Even if they were advanced, why go to Egypt? You mentioned they were dodging cataclysms. Are we talking about a localized flood or something bigger?
To understand the motive for the migration, the sources required us to pull back much further and look at the archaic 138-year cyclic reset grid.
Okay, what is that?
This is a chronological framework developed by researcher Jason Breschers.
Right. And what physically triggers a 138-year reset? Because honestly, that sounds terrifying. Are we talking about rogue planets, solar flares?
The archaic framework proposes that human history is continually interrupted by cyclical, planetary-scale cataclysms, and these are driven by periodic orbital resets, often referred to in ancient texts as the Phoenix or Nemesis cycles.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, we're talking about predictable cyclical astronomical events that cause severe atmospheric and geological upheavals, events that correspond to the Bronze Age collapse, or the sudden, violent end of the Pleistocene epoch, or the fall of Atlantis.
Wait, Atlantis. The sources actually bring Atlantis into this.
Yes, and it's treated not as a myth, but as a literal cartographic reality. I mean, one of the ancient maps provided in our source material explicitly marks Atlantis as a pre-cataclysmic continent off the western coast of Europe.
That's wild. So how did this ancient British civilization know these resets were coming? Did they just look at a calendar?
Well, they were master astronomers. Yeah. Think about the megalithic structures scattered across Britain, Stonehenge, Avebury, Callanish.
Mainstream history views those as primitive religious sites, right?
Right. But the sources recontextualize them as massive, sophisticated astronomical observatories. The Cymric sacerdotal elite, which is the scholarly ruling class, were meticulously tracking these orbital periodicities. They knew the math of the cosmos.
So if you are an advanced, literate society and your astronomical clocks are telling you that a global reset is approaching, you aren't just going to sit in your wooden halls and wait to be wiped out.
Exactly.
You're going to initiate a master continuity plan.
Precisely. They executed a targeted multi-generational migration. This elite sacerdotal class gathered their legal language, their royal lineages, and their astronomical coordinate systems, and they moved.
Down to Egypt.
Yes, they traveled out of Albion, down through Europe, across the Mediterranean, seeking a specific geographical profile.
They needed somewhere safe. But I mean, nowhere on Earth is truly safe from a planetary cataclysm, right?
No, but you can look for geological stability and, crucially, an arid climate. They needed a place where they could carve their records into stone and gold without the moisture and glaciation of northern Europe grinding those records to dust.
And that location was the Nile Valley.
Exactly.
So Egypt wasn't just another territory to conquer. It was literally a panic room. It was the Nile Preservation Vault.
What's fascinating here is if we connect this to the broader archaeological anomalies of Egypt, it explains a lot.
How so?
Well, mainstream Egyptology constantly struggles with the sudden explosion of highly advanced megalithic and linguistic culture in early Egypt. It seems to just appear fully formed out of nowhere.
Right.
The sources argue it appeared fully formed because it was imported. It was a mid-cycle preservation tactic by a migrating elite.
And the plan was always to return home.
Always. Once the cataclysm passed and the Earth stabilized, the descendants of that royal line carrying the title deeds and the astronomical markers returned to their ancestral sanctuary in Britain to reestablish their sovereignty.
Okay, but let me play devil's advocate here for a second.
Go for it.
If this massive, continent-spanning Arthurian lineage actually returned and ruled Britain, why on earth is Arthur considered fairy tale material today? Even if the timeline was shifted by 33 years, how do you just lose the physical memory of a massive empire?
You don't lose it. It was deliberately scrubbed. And the sources point directly to the 1700s as the era of obfuscation.
The 1700s, but that's fairly recent.
Yes. And the cartographic evidence, the actual historical maps, is undeniable. If you look at maps of Wales and Britain produced prior to the 1700s, this history is written right there on the physical landscape.
Give me an example. What kind of maps are we talking about?
Well, one of the primary sources provided is a map from the 1570s, drafted by a cartographer named Humphrey Ludd. It's called the Cambriate Typus.
Okay.
When you examine this map and zoom in on the Morganwg and Gwent regions, which is basically the mountainous area above the Vale of Glamorgan in southeast Wales, The mountains themselves are explicitly labeled. They are called Arthur Cadair.
Arthur Cadair. What does that translate to?
In Welsh, Cadair means chair or seat. It literally translates to Arthur's seat or Arthur's presidency.
Oh, wow. So the actual topography was legally named after Arthur.
Exactly. And it's not an isolated example either. If you look at John Speed's maps from the 1600s, you find places clearly marked as Arthur's Butts Hill, right in the middle of Wales.
That's crazy.
This area was surrounded by an incredibly complex ancient fortress system that was later used to repel Norman invaders. The land itself was stamped with the Arthurian royal presence. Everyone knew it was there.
So what happened in the 1700s then?
A systemic political rewrite. The Hanoverian succession in Britain, which is when a German royal dynasty took the British throne, brought a political necessity to erase the ancient native royal lineages.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, they needed to legitimize their rule, and you can't really do that if the native population still remembers their ancient sovereign Arthurian bloodline.
Right. So they initiated a massive propaganda campaign.
They replaced the native history with a constructed Anglo-Saxon narrative. The Arthurian names were literally scrubbed from the newly commissioned maps.
Wow.
The ancient histories were relegated to mythology and fairy tales. The physical artifacts were ignored, destroyed, or aggressively relabeled as Roman. It was a complete systemic severing of the British people from their own sovereign memory.
Infuriating, honestly.
Sure.
But it perfectly sets up the next major hurdle in this theory.
Which is?
If this British elite moved into Egypt and built this massive preservation vault before returning, they must have left records. I mean, you don't go to a panic room and not write anything down, right?
Definitely not. They carved millions of hieroglyphs.
But we've been told for 200 years that we do know how to read hieroglyphs, thanks to the Rosetta Stone and a French scholar named Jean-François Champollion. And standard translations don't say anything about ancient Wales.
Which brings us directly to the AI2 focus, the linguistic and acoustic decoder. This is the mechanism that proves the physical chain of custody.
Okay, let's get into it.
To read the true narrative of the Nile Vault, our sources argue that we have to entirely throw out Champollion's phonetic rulebook because it is fundamentally flawed.
I really want to dig into this because the story of how we supposedly translate Egyptian hieroglyphs is wild to me. Champollion back in the 1820s is credited with cracking the code. But how did he actually do it?
He essentially made a massive, unverified assumption. Champollion decided, apparently based in part on a revelation he had when he was just 11 years old, that hieroglyphs were individual phonetic letters based on the Coptic language.
Wait, Coptic? Why Coptic?
Because Coptic was the latest surviving descendant of the Egyptian language used by the Christian church in Egypt. There was no established field of Egyptology at the time.
Right.
Champollion and his English rival, Sir Thomas Young, were desperately trying to force these ancient symbols into a phonetic alphabet so they could spell out the Greek names they knew were on the Rosetta Stone, like Ptolemy and Alexander.
So they already knew the answers they wanted, and they just reverse-engineered the symbols to fit those Greek names.
Exactly. And when Champollion couldn't find a Coptic word that fit a specific symbol, he would just borrow from Aramaic or Hebrew, or eventually he would just guess based on context.
That's like finding a modern computer keyboard thousands of years from now and assuming every single key must be a musical note.
Yeah, that's a good way to look at it.
And when you press them and it doesn't make a song, you don't question your theory. You just start retuning the piano until it vaguely sounds like Mary Had a Little Lamb. I mean, it's a completely forced matrix.
It is. The fatal flaw was treating the hieroglyphs primarily as individual letters spelling out words rather than complete concepts. And this is where our source material introduces the groundbreaking work of Ross Broadstock and his framework known as simroglyphics.
Simroglyphics, basically Welsh hieroglyphs.
Yes. Broadstock posits that hieroglyphs are not individual letters. Every single hieroglyph is an entire word unto itself.
Okay.
And the language you need to read those words, the acoustic key, is not Coptic. It is native Old Welsh, the Cymric language.
Okay, but how does that actually work mechanically? If a hieroglyph is an entire word, how do they write abstract sentences?
The mechanism they use is called the rebus principle. It's an acoustic cipher. You don't draw the meaning of what you want to say. You draw something that sounds like the word you want to use.
Oh, it's like modern text emojis.
Exactly like that.
Like if I want to text you the word belief, I don't try to draw an abstract concept of faith. I text you an image of a bumblebee and an image of a green leaf. Bee leaf. I don't mean a literal insect sitting on a tree. I'm using the acoustic sound of the images.
That is exactly how Simmerglyphics operates. It is an incredibly sophisticated visual acoustic cipher. They were writing in Welsh, but using the rebus principle to encode it.
Wow.
And when you apply the ancient Qumric dictionary to the hieroglyphs, the translation ceases to be a string of religious, mythological guesses and instantly becomes coherent, legal, and descriptive sentences.
I need to hear some concrete examples of this because this is where my mind was completely blown reading the sources. Let's look at the concept of welcome.
Okay.
If you are an ancient scribe in Egypt trying to carve the word welcome onto a temple wall, how do you draw that? Open arms, a door.
Well, you have to look at the Welsh vocabulary. The Welsh word for welcome is croeso. If you have ever driven across the border into modern Wales, you see it on the road signs everywhere. Croeso, I Gymru, welcome to Wales.
Okay, so the word is croeso. What sounds like croeso?
The Welsh word for a physical cross is cros.
Are you kidding me? So using the rebus principle, they just drew a cross.
Yes. Whenever you see a cross symbol in Egyptian hieroglyphs, mainstream Egyptology often spins complex theories about it being a generic religious symbol or a marker of the afterlife.
Right.
But under the Simmerglyphic matrix, it literally just means welcome. Crows for croso.
That is staggeringly simple. But does this work for more complex sentences?
Yeah.
Let's take a common architectural symbol. You see the rectangular square symbol everywhere in Egypt. What did Champollion think that was?
Champollion believed the rectangular square was the phonetic letter P. He needed a P to spell Ptolemy, so he just forced it. He actually concluded that the ancient Egyptians, one of the greatest building cultures in human history, simply didn't have a specific word for door.
Which is logically absurd.
Totally absurd.
Right, they built the massive Karnak temple complex, but they just couldn't figure out what to call the entrance. So Broadstock looks at that rectangle and says, what?
He looks at it and says, that is a door. And in Welsh, the word for an entrance or a door is porth.
Okay, but if it just means door, how is that a cipher?
Because of the dual meaning inherent in ancient Qumric roots, this is the engine of the entire system. The root of the word porth is por, and por in ancient Qumric means supreme one, or sovereign.
Oh, wow. So they draw a door, which is porth, because the root sound por means supreme one. It's literally an acoustic pun.
Exactly.
Let's build on that. The sources mention that you frequently see that door symbol next to a semicircle. What did Champollion do with the semicircle?
Champollion thought the semicircle was the letter T, again, trying to force Greek names. But Broadstock identifies that semicircle visually. It is not an abstract letter. It is a depiction of a traditional Welsh flat-bottomed cake called a Tishan lap.
A cake. Standard Egyptology says it's a tea, and Broadstock says it's a baked good. I mean, I can see why academics might scoff at that initially, but what is the linguistic payoff?
The payoff is huge. The root word of Tishan lap is tea. And in Welsh, tea means you are.
So when you put the door and the cake together on a temple wall in Egypt, it's not the letters P and T. You don't read them as letters. You read the Welsh roots. Por and T. Supreme one you are.
Exactly. It's a full sentence. It's a sovereign title.
And this completely deconstructs the famous Greek names that Champollion supposedly translated to prove his theory, doesn't it? Let's talk about the cartouche for Cleopatra, because that is the cornerstone of mainstream Egyptology.
Right. Mainstream Egyptology translates the hieroglyphs in her cartouche to literally spell out Cleopatra. But Broadstock noticed a glaring error in Champollion's translation.
What was it?
When you look at the actual symbols, Cleopatra's name is spelled with a symbol of a hand specifically, a threatening hand or a fist.
Wait, if he's using a phonetic alphabet, how does a hand fit into Cleopatra? There's no H or F in her name.
In the phonetic system they constructed, the hand symbol carries a D sound.
A D. So Champollion translated it as Cleopatra with a D. Why would they spell her name wrong on her own royal monument?
Because, according to Broadstock, it's not an acronym spelling a Greek name at all. It's a descriptive Welsh sentence confirming her title. In Qumric, if you combine the symbol of the threatening hand, which represents a strike or a threat, utilizing that D sound, with the symbol of an open mouth.
Wait, what does the open mouth mean in Welsh?
It means to proclaim or give orders.
So you have a threatening fist and a proclaiming mouth.
Right. And when you combine those root concepts in Qumric, the acoustic result means to threaten and pronounce, which translates, in a sovereign context, to rule. You give the orders and you have the fist to back it up.
So they deliberately used the hand symbol in her cartouche, not because they couldn't spell Cleopatra, but because they were spelling out her sovereign title, the ruler.
Yes. This entirely recontextualizes our understanding of ancient literacy. The hieroglyphs were never magical spells intended for the underworld. They were never just phonetic letters for spelling foreign names.
They functioned as a highly robust, phonetic, legal language.
Absolutely. And it proves that the migrating Kumric royalty maintained their native language perfectly intact over thousands of miles and across cataclysmic epochs.
My absolute favorite example of this from the sources, and honestly, this is the one that really sold me on the elegance of the rebus principle, is the goose and the sun. You see this combination everywhere outside of royal cartouches in Egypt, a bird sitting next to a sun disk.
Let's break down the acoustics of those two symbols.
Okay, the Welsh word for sun is hall, but the sources point out that the ancient root, specifically still found in North Wales dialects, is Ra, just like the Egyptian sun god, and it means power.
Correct. And the Welsh word for a goose is gwydd, but gwydd has a crucial dual meaning. It also means knowledge or presence.
So on a literal conceptual level, combining the goose and the sun means in the presence of power. But here is where the phonetic cipher does its magic. If you take the root of sun, which is Ra, and the root for goose, which is gwydd, and say them together,
Aragwydd.
it sounds exactly like Argylwydd, which is the Welsh word for lord or master.
Yes, it is.
To this day, if you go into a modern Welsh chapel, you will hear people praising the Arglwydd, the Lord. They were drawing a goose and a sun to acoustically spell out the word for Lord. It is breathtakingly elegant.
What's vital to understand here is that Broadstock isn't just throwing darts at a board. He is applying a consistent native dictionary to a foreign-located script, and it produces coherent legal and royal titles every single time. It doesn't require guessing.
So conceptually, the language works. The simmerglyphic acoustic decoder ring functions. But words are just words. If this massive elite migration actually happened, they would have had to leave physical, undeniable artifacts in the Egyptian preservation vault to prove they were there.
And did they? They absolutely did.
This is where we bring in the AI-1 focus, right? Auditing the artifacts.
Exactly. We have to audit those artifacts using the linguistic key we just discussed. When you read the physical artifacts in Kumric, we begin to see the true nature of the vault. These artifacts were not religious art, they were trans-cataclysmic legal networks. Let's start with one of the most famous astronomical artifacts in the world, the Dendera zodiac.
Oh, this is a massive circular bas relief found on the ceiling of the Temple of Hathor in Egypt. It's covered in constellations and figures.
Yeah.
And standard Egyptology will tell you this is a Greco-Roman astrological map carved around 50 BCE depicting the soul's journey of the god Osiris. It's treated as, devotional funerary mythology.
But when you apply the simmerglyphic matrix to the symbols and cross-reference it with the Archae's 138-year reset timeline we discussed earlier, a completely different document emerges. The Dendera ceiling is not a mythological map. It is a pre-reset astronomical coordinate grid.
Wait, so it's a map of the sky, but for a very specific purpose.
It is a precise map of the planetary alignments as they existed in the sky prior to a systemic global collapse. Think of it as a sovereign land grant.
How does a map of the stars act as a land grant, though?
Because it proves temporal and geographic origin. By etching the exact configuration of the heavens into stone, the migrating Kumric elite were locking in their domain claims. They were basically saying, this is what the sky looked like when we left Albion. This is the astronomical timestamp of our sovereignty. They brought this data from Britain and locked it into the permanent bedrock of Egypt to survive the reset.
It's exactly like saving a time-stamped backup of your hard drive right before a massive power surge. They knew the cataclysm was coming, so they built a permanent astronomical clock to prove exactly when they were and who they were for whoever survived.
Exactly. And that intense desire to preserve sovereign identity extends to the most famous burial artifacts as well. Consider the inner electrum coffin of Tutankhamun.
Right. Arguably the most recognizable golden artifact in human history. The mainstream narrative says the hieroglyphic bands wrapping around that coffin are just magical funerary spells to protect the boy king in the afterlife, right? Like pulled straight from the Egyptian Book of the Dead.
However, when those golden bands are redecoded via the Kumric root acoustics, when you stop trying to read them as Coptic spells about the underworld, those bands reveal themselves as incredibly detailed genealogical logs.
Wait, so there is no magic spell. What does it actually say?
It documents the direct migration routes and the familial lineage of the royal Tidane and Kumric lines across the Near East.
It's a family tree? It's an ancestral deed of trust written in solid electrum gold so it wouldn't tarnish or degrade over millennia.
Yep.
I have to use an analogy here because this is just so wild. It's as if archaeologists 2,000 years from now dug up the United States Constitution, couldn't read English, saw the Great Seal, and assumed it was a mythological poem about an eagle and a bunch of guys in powdered wigs,
Right.
rather than a binding legal and territorial contract.
That analogy is highly accurate. For 2 centuries, we have been fundamentally misinterpreting administrative continuity as religious superstition. And we see this evidence not just in the central tombs, but even on the geographical fringes of Egypt.
You mean in what are known as the boundary markers?
Yeah.
Right. Our sources detail the Wadi El Hol desert rock panel and the Serabit El Qadim Sphinx inscriptions, located way out in the Sinai Peninsula. Now, historically, these are usually dismissed as just primitive proto-Sinaitic graffiti, right?
That's the mainstream view, yes.
The standard story goes that some uneducated Semitic turquoise miners were out in the harsh desert, saw some Egyptian hieroglyphs, and just scratched out a few crude, illiterate messages on a sphinx and a rock wall.
But the forensic extraction from our sources proves otherwise. These are not graffiti scratched by miners. They are early linear boundary contracts. They are sacerdotal title deeds.
Written, once again, in the core Qumric acoustic cipher.
Exactly. They represent the transitional epigraphic record. The surviving elite scribes were out in the desert margins, actively etching post-cataclysmic territorial decrees and migration markers. They were surveying the land after the reset, ensuring their territorial rights were preserved in stone. The immense physical effort required to execute these carvings in remote, hostile desert locations or on solid gold coffins demonstrates that this was not casual art. It was a deliberate, highly organized, mid-cycle preservation tactic.
Okay, so the data is locked in the Nile vault, the cataclysm passes, the cycle turns. But to complete the sovereign circuit, they can't just stay in Egypt forever.
No, they can't.
The sources say the plan was always to return home to Albion. But if they did, where is the proof? Where is the physical chain of custody proving that this specific bloodline made it back to Britain to establish the historical Arthurian lineage?
Well, this is where the physical and linguistic evidence converges back on British soil. And the first piece of evidence is the script itself. If they brought their administrative knowledge back, they needed a way to write it down outside of Egyptian hieroglyphs.
Right.
Enter the Colburn cipher.
I read about this in the sources. Mainstream academia has routinely dismissed the Colburn, specifically these wooden alphabet frames known as Pithanin or Colbreny Beard, as 18th century romantic forgeries.
Yeah, that's the standard line.
They basically claim that Welsh antiquarians, like a guy named Iolo Morganwg, just made up a fake alphabet to sound cool and mystical.
That has been the prevailing academic dismissal. But Wilson and Blackett, alongside the forensic sources we are analyzing, prove that this is completely false. The Colburn is not an 18th century invention. It is the ancient 10 to 20 letter linear alphabet of the Qumric people.
How do they know it's ancient, though?
Because it is the foundational cipher tool preserved by Qumric bards specifically to record sovereign deeds and astronomical alignments long before the Romans ever set foot in Britain.
Oh, wow.
And the definitive proof that it is ancient is that it is carved into solid stone across the British Isles in ways that 18th century forgers couldn't possibly have fabricated. We have to look at the Newton stone.
Ugh, the Newton stone in Aberdeenshire, Scotland. This is one of those great, enduring archaeological mysteries.
It really is.
For decades, experts have looked at the inscriptions on this standing pillar and categorized it as corrupt Pictish, or a really bad attempt at debased Latin, or just an illegible form of Gaelic Ogham script. Nobody could read it coherently.
Because they were using the wrong phonetic key. They were trying to read it as Latin or Gaelic. When you apply the Colburn cipher to the linear strokes and read it using Qumric roots, the Newton stone decodes cleanly.
And what does it say?
It is a pre-Roman royal memorial. It operates as a land grant, explicitly recording the sovereign migrations of the elite back into northern Britain.
It's the physical receipt of their return journey. They carve their arrival back into the stone. And it gets even more undeniable when we move down from Scotland into Wales to the Pillar of Eliseg in Llangollen.
Right. Standard history labels the Pillar of Eliseg as a 9th century post-Roman Christian cross erected by a local minor king named Singin to honor his great-grandfather. But our source analysis reframes this artifact entirely. It is not just a local memorial. It is a primary forensic genealogical marker.
It is a bloodline receipt. The inscriptions on that pillar establish a continuous pre-Roman royal lineage. It links the British sovereign dynasties directly back to the ancient Mediterranean and Near Eastern monarchies. It explicitly connects the dots of the migration we've been tracking.
Absolutely. But the physical chain of custody isn't just limited to standing stones and pillars. Wilson and Blackett discovered that the returning Cumbric sovereigns actually reshaped the physical landscape of Wales to reflect the astronomical data they had preserved in Egypt.
The Glamorgan earth mounds, this absolutely blew my mind. When you think of ancient massive geoglyphs, you usually think of the Nazca lines in Peru or the massive animal effigy mounds in North America.
Sure.
But the sources reveal a staggering system of massive earthworks right in southeast Wales, in the Morgan and Gwent areas.
We are talking about colossal mounds of earth, primarily situated on hilltops, spanning a massive 45 to 50-mile east-to-west grid across the Welsh landscape.
And they aren't random hills, right? Wilson and Blackett realized that the ancient names of these specific mounds corresponded perfectly to ancient Arabic, Hebrew, and Egyptian names for stars. For instance, they found a mound called Oblidiad, which translates to ferocious warrior.
Which is the exact ancient name used by Middle Eastern cultures for the primary star in the constellation Hercules.
Wow. They found another area of mounds called Chumblum, which means he-goat, which corresponds directly to the constellation Capricorn.
Yep.
On the Garth Mountain, northwest of Cardiff, they located a grouping of mounds perfectly mirroring the constellation of Orion. And crucially, they found a site mapping perfectly to Sirius, directly matching the astronomical data from the Dendera zodiac in Egypt.
Are you picturing the scale of this? They have Sirius, Hercules, and Capricorn mapped out on the ground in Wales, and using the angles between those three specific constellations, they could triangulate the exact location of the pole star on the physical ground.
This makes the Nazca lines look like a warm-up act.
Yeah.
I mean, they were literally stamping their stellar title deeds, their astronomical preservation data from the Nile Vault onto the Welsh landscape. They were physically marrying the sky to the earth in Albion.
And at the dead center of this astronomical matrix, triangulated perfectly by these star mounds, lies the undeniable physical evidence of the historical Arthur.
Yes.
The return of the sovereign line culminated in two distinct historical kings, Arthur I and Arthur II.
And I want to be really clear here for you listening. We are not talking about mythical medieval knights in shining armor sitting at a magical round table with a wizard. We're talking about real, historical Iron Age kings with tangible physical artifacts.
Exactly.
The sources detail local Glamorgan inscribed stones and, most astonishingly, an electrum cross.
The inscription on the cross is not ambiguous at all. It reads clearly, Pro Anima Artorius, for the soul of Arthur.
It's a royal burial marker. And yet this evidence has been aggressively suppressed. Wilson and Blackett detail a massive discovery, a 5-acre ancient British palace located in Wales. We're talking about cyclopean walls, a meter wide, extensive and intricate mosaic floors, painted murals, a structure matching the grandeur of anything you would find in the Mediterranean.
Carbon dating and historical records align the destruction of this massive palace with a devastating comet strike that occurred around 562 AD.
But when local excavations began in the late 19th century to uncover this 5-acre palace, men in suits from London arrived.
They immediately halted the dig, they covered it up, sealed the site, and forbade any further excavation under the guise of protecting the land.
I mean, come on. Men in suits shutting down an archaeological dig sounds like the plot of an Indiana Jones movie. Why would they care?
Well, it is a glaring physical example of the systemic obfuscation we discussed earlier regarding the 1700s map rewrites. A 5-acre, highly advanced ancient palace protruding from the Welsh soil directly physically contradicts the Hanoverian and Anglo-Saxon narrative of a primitive, uncivilized Britain waiting for Roman salvation.
So it had to be buried. The timeline had to be protected.
Precisely. And this suppression extends to what might be the ultimate, most controversial artifact of this entire migrating sacerdotal class, the Ark of the Covenant.
Look, I have to push back here. The Ark of the Covenant in Wales, that is a massive claim. We're talking about the central artifact of biblical history. How do the sources justify placing it in Britain?
It connects back to the linguistic and geographic mapping we just discussed. Local ancient tales in Wales talk about a massive wooden box containing a fabulous, powerful treasure buried north of Cardiff, and the legends say it is guarded by Cigvan Goa,
which translates to what?
It means two giant flesh-eating ravens, two winged figures guarding a sacred wooden box.
Oh, wow.
The parallels to the biblical description of the golden cherubim on the mercy seat of the ark are unmistakable.
Okay, but a legend about birds in a box isn't physical proof.
Wilson and Blackett didn't stop at legends. They traced ancient Etruscan inscriptions indicating the ark was moved from Egypt to Israel and eventually taken by ship to the west by this migrating elite. Following the geographical clues, the Kolbrin linguistic markers, and the stellar alignments of the earth mounds, they zeroed in on a highly specific location in Wales.
And what did they find at this location?
A vast man-made mound, surrounded by an oval stone wall with no visible gates or entrances. The central area is named Galug, meaning place of worship, but it is the older, pre-industrial Qumric name of the site that is critical, Anis Abul.
Let's use the acoustic decoder. What does Anis Abul mean?
Anis means island or enclosure, and BYL or BIL translates to ark, the enclosure of the ark.
Okay, the name matches, but did they actually dig?
When they examined the site, they didn't just find dirt. They found highly sophisticated underground drainage systems shafts filled with white stones that had to have been imported from over 300 miles away.
Wait, why?
These shafts were designed to keep a deep underground chamber completely dry in the wet Welsh climate.
And using advanced metal detection equipment.
They located a massive non-ferrous object, non-magnetic metal, potentially gold or silver, measuring roughly 4 feet by 2 feet, sealed deep within that dry chamber.
A box, 4 feet by 2 feet, covered in non-ferrous metal, hidden exactly where the stellar map and the linguistic clues said it would be.
Yeah.
This completes the physical chain of custody. The bloodline, the language, the astronomy, and the sacred artifacts made the full circuit from Albion to the Nile Vault and back to Albion.
Which brings us to the final and perhaps most profound question of our deep dive today. If all of this physical and linguistic evidence has been sitting in plain sight, carved into Scottish pillars, built into Welsh shells, painted on Egyptian ceilings, why is it only being synthesized now?
Right. Why are researchers like Wilson, Blackett, and Broadstock suddenly breaking through 2 centuries of entrenched academic dogma?
To answer that, the sources say we have to look beneath our feet. We have to talk about what they call the sacerdotal ley line awakening.
Our source manifest details an epistemic reconstruction that is actually being driven by the physical geology of Albion itself. The British Isles, and England and Wales specifically, sit atop a highly active geodetic memory lattice.
We're talking about ley lines. The St. Michael ley line, which runs perfectly straight from Cornwall through Glastonbury and Avebury all the way to the Norfolk coast, and the Bolanus line running north to south.
Now, usually when people talk about ley lines, it gets dismissed as New Age mysticism, right? Just imaginary lines drawn on a map.
But the sources treat these not as mystical concepts, but as literal telluric hardware. The bedrock beneath these specific lines consists of incredibly high concentrations of quartz-bearing granite, massive limestone aquifers, and deliberately placed ancient standing stones.
And quartz is piezoelectric. It can store and transmit electromagnetic frequencies. It's the exact same fundamental technology we use in modern hard drives and silicon computer chips, just operating on a massive geological scale.
The manifest posits that this physical landmass retains the electromagnetic signatures of the original Qumric sacerdotal class, the very people who engineered these megaliths as astronomical clocks and pre-reset anchor points. They programmed the grid with their acoustic and historical data.
And this creates what the sources call the subconscious intuitive drag. I mean, have you ever felt irrationally drawn to a certain historical mystery? Have you ever felt a physical, unexplainable pull to investigate a specific ancient site or dig into a specific ancient text?
The researchers who are piecing this transcataclysmic circuit together today, those living or operating along these telluric nodes, are experiencing a synchronized awakening.
It's amazing.
It is a localized geodetic resonance triggering ancestral memory recall. They are acting as biological antennas, tuning into a high quartz terrestrial hard drive that is broadcasting dormant pre-cataclysmic data.
It's not just intellectual curiosity. The Earth itself is prompting us to remember. The institutional narrative that was imposed in the 1700s, the fake maps, the scrubbed timelines, was designed to sever the population from this energetic landscape. But you simply can't erase a frequency that is permanently embedded in the bedrock.
This raises an important question regarding modern duty. The individuals answering this intuitive call are effectively taking up the mantle of the ancient Qumric scribes. Their objective is active forensic reconstruction.
Right, translating the stones via native acoustic roots, mapping the catastrophic reset to periodicities of the archaic grid, and broadcasting this synthesized truth to the public.
They are repairing the broken timeline so that the pre-reset sovereign identity survives the next cycle.
It is a localized British memory, expanding into a global chronological overhaul.
It really is.
What an absolute journey. Let's take a breath and recap exactly what we have uncovered today. We started with a shattered, deliberately obfuscated historical timeline that hid a highly advanced, ancient British civilization. We learned how they anticipated global cataclysms and initiated a sovereign circuit, migrating down into Egypt.
We discovered how to read the records they left in the Nile Preservation Vault, not as magic spells for the dead, but as binding legal deeds and astronomical maps, decoded perfectly by the native Welsh acoustic cipher, semiglyphics.
We tracked their physical return to Britain, auditing the chain of custody through the Colburn alphabet, the Newton stone, the Pillar of Eliseg, and the staggering stellar map stamped into the Glamorgan earth mounds, proving the historical reality of the Arthurian royal lineage.
And finally, we explored how the piezoelectric geology of the British Isles is actively triggering a modern sacerdotal awakening, compelling a new generation to remember this suppressed history.
It changes everything. It completely rewrites the map of human civilization.
Which leaves us with a final striking image from our source materials to consider. The last pages of a book are already contained in the first pages.
I love that quote. It perfectly encapsulates the loop.
If the Cymric circuit is truly a loop migrating from Albion to Egypt and back to Albion, then human history is not a straight line we are blindly walking forward on. It is a wheel. And if the artifacts of the deep past, the Dendera zodiac, the Electrum coffin, the Newton stone, were actually encoded instructions preserved for a post-cataclysmic future.
What messages are currently being carved in stone today, waiting for the next cycle to discover them?
Exactly.
Are we building our own preservation vaults right now, deep underground or in the cloud, without even realizing it? Think about that next time you look at a massive modern monument or feel that strange, intuitive pull to a historical mystery. Keep your eyes open, question the history books you were handed, and keep digging. Until next time.